Good afternoon. I think we're going to get started if you're ready to get started. Can you hear me okay? Does that sound all right? Yeah? Welcome. My name is Cameron Conant. I am from just down the road, Walthamstow. Need to point the right direction. Walthamstow. So I'm local. I know David. Thank you, David, for having me to this brilliant environmental fair. It's like a fair outside. This is really cool. A little bit about me before I start my talk. And I'm going to be talking about divestment today. And I don't know if any of you know much about that, but hopefully you'll leave here feeling like you know a little bit more about divestment, and you feel like you understand why it's important, and you might even want to get involved in doing something about it. My background is in communications. I am a trustee for an environmental charity called Operation Noah. Don't know if anyone's heard of that charity. I'm also their communications officer. We work at Operation Noah to get churches and faith groups to do lots of things, but primarily engage on the environmental crisis. And one of the main things we do is get faith groups to divest from fossil fuels and invest in climate solutions. And we do that with faith groups in this country and around the world, and I'll talk more about that. The other thing I'm involved in is Citizens UK. I'm part of the Just Transition campaign. I'm one of the leaders of that campaign. Citizens UK is the biggest community organizing alliance in the country. It's faith groups and schools and universities and colleges and community groups, and we come together to work for the common good. And one of our big campaigns, and Vanessa's, my wife's back there doing the slides today. Vanessa and I have been involved in this. We've listened to hundreds of people over the last several years around London, hundreds of community leaders, about what they're concerned about related to all kinds of things, including climate. And the thing that kept coming up that we decided to do was around fuel poverty, which is a big issue now as fuel prices keep going up, and around green jobs. And so we've got a campaign. We're working with the Mayor of London. We're working with councils around the country to get, I think it's 100,000 is our goal, fuel-poor homes retrofitted, or future-fitted, as someone suggested to me we should call it, and create 60,000 good green jobs and apprenticeships around London. So that's part of that Just Transition campaign. And the whole idea around that campaign is making sure that the transition we need to make to a carbon-neutral city is fair and fast, and that it helps people who most need it, rather than makes life more difficult for people already struggling. So that's a bit about me and what I'm involved in. I want to talk to you today about divestment, which is something we're really involved with, as I said, with Operation Noah. And some of you will know a bit about that, and others of you will think, tell me more, Cameron. I don't know. I don't know anything. So hopefully I'll hit on the different levels of knowledge in here, and that it won't be too boring for people who know something, and it'll be really helpful for people who don't know as much. On a really basic level, divestment or disinvestment is taking money out of fossil fuels, out of fossil fuel companies, and putting that money into a climate-positive solution. And so when we do that, we're doing a couple of things. One of the things we're doing is, on a really basic level, we're making it more expensive and difficult for fossil fuel companies to fund their projects. So we're making borrowing money and finding investment more difficult by saying this money is now off limits to fossil fuel companies. The other thing we're doing, and you can look to what happened with the tobacco industry as a great example of this, is we're removing the social license. So with the divestment movement, which is now a global movement, I'll talk about that in a second, we're now saying it's now no longer okay. As a society, we now say it's no longer okay to invest in these companies. And we'll, again, look at that. We'll look at why it's not okay to invest in these companies and what they're getting up to. But like with the tobacco, the movement against cigarette use, where we started to say, actually, we don't want everyone to smoke in all of our restaurants. And actually, we do want to put big labels on cigarette packaging to say, this is dangerous. And actually, we don't want television adverts for cigarettes. That movement is now happening with fossil fuels, and the divestment movement is really integral to that. Next slide, Vanessa, thank you. So there's a really positive story to tell around divestment and how global this movement now is. I mean, there are now, and I think this number has since been updated, you can see those bolded stats there. There are now over 1,500 institutions that have committed to some form of fossil fuel divestment around the world. And that represents, try to get your mind around this, that represents over $39 trillion worth of assets under management. And that's often the phrase we use in the divestment world. When institutions divest, we look at all of their assets, that we call them assets under management, and we now say, that's no longer available to fossil fuel companies. So 39.2 trillion, that's as if the two biggest economies in the world, the US and China, collectively divested from fossil fuels. Next slide, please. One of the really exciting things for me, as someone who works with faith institutions, and the reason it's important to work with faith institutions is that over 80% of the world is part of a faith institution. So most people around the world, it may not be true in Western Europe or this country, most people around the world engage or are part of a faith institution, a mosque, a church, a synagogue, some kind of faith group. And those institutions are moral communities, and they have values, and they act on those values. So it's really exciting that the number one group that's divesting are faith organizations. And that's really important because these communities are often looked to in various places around the world for the stances they're taking on issues. And then we've got educational institutions, philanthropic, government, pension funds, divesting. Next slide, please. This is something I was involved in just this week, just this past week. We had 35 faith institutions divest from 7 different countries around the world, and those institutions represented over £1 billion in total assets. We had some Church of England dioceses in this country. We had a cathedral, Leicester Cathedral in Leicester. We had the Methodist Church in Ireland. We had groups from all over the world saying, we're no longer going to invest in fossil fuels because we understand what these companies are actually doing, and we don't want them using our money. Next slide, please. So, forgive me, we've probably got scientists here, we've probably got people who know way more than I do, and I hope we can maybe have a little Q&A afterwards and you can share with me, so I'm not just imparting things to you, because we've got knowledge in the room. But on a really basic level, what's the problem, Cameron, you might ask, with fossil fuels? Well, fossil fuels literally fuel the climate crisis. When we burn oil, gas, and coal, that supercharges what we call the greenhouse effect that's warming the planet. And we now know that it's dangerously warming the planet. And these emissions are almost entirely caused, not entirely, but largely caused by the burning of fossil fuels. So this dangerous warming we're now seeing, scientists say, is unequivocally the result of human activity. So there's not really any question, there's not really any reasonable doubt anymore as to what the driving force of global heating is. It's us. It's the burning of these things that we use to heat our homes and move our vehicles and power our industry. And what's the result of that? The result of that is torrential rain and severe weather events and drought and all of these things that we're seeing around the world, incredible levels of heat that we're seeing in Europe and other places, India. That photo at the bottom, if you can make it out, is from Walthamstow, and that was last summer. Because we know that when there's the amount of carbon that there is in the atmosphere, we know you get heavier rains. When it rains, it can really rain. And we had those torrential downpours last summer here in London. I think we had, I don't know how many weeks worth of rain in a few hours. And there were streets in Walthamstow that were flooded, maybe here in Leytonstone as well. Next slide, please. People always say to me, okay, Cameron, that's great, but how did you get here today? How did you cook your food? Don't we need this stuff? Well, yes and no. We need to transition, is what we need, and very quickly. In fact, in 2021, the International Energy Agency, which is the kind of global authority on the energy industry, said that all new oil and gas developments from the end of 2021 needed to be stopped. Okay? Any new oil, gas, or coal development needs to be stopped. And yet, they're not being stopped. And in this country, in the UK, our government continues to say that they have ambitions to approve new North Sea oil and gas projects. But what else is being said? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, this is the kind of global group of scientists who look at all the best peer-reviewed scientific research and literature and then make their reports. They're saying that we effectively have to cut carbon emissions by the end of this decade. So by 2030, we have to almost cut in half our emissions, and they're still going up. Next slide, please. The other question we get is, what about the price of energy? Okay, that sounds great, Cameron, but it sounds like you want people to freeze, or you want people to not be able to cook their food. Well, no, that's not true at all. And in fact, new oil and gas projects, which will take years to develop, whilst renewable energy is starting to go through the roof, will only worsen the problem. Because actually, these oil and gas, we're subject to these global markets that fluctuate wildly. And even the UK, what used to be the UK business minister, I have no idea who the UK business minister is. If anyone knows, let me know at the moment. But Greg Hans, who was the UK business minister, even admits, it's the global price of gas that sets the UK price. And in fact, we know that a lot of the oil and gas that's gotten out of the North Sea is shipped elsewhere anyway. So really, to lower energy bills, we need to massively increase renewable energy, and we need to invest in energy reduction and energy saving measures like insulation, which would be an easy, quick win if we could insulate more of our housing stock. We have a very poorly insulated housing stock in this country. Next slide, please. So we've got this rhetoric versus reality. If you go to any of the big oil and gas companies' websites right now, or I challenge you even to go on their Twitter feed right now and look at what is Exxon saying, what is Shell saying, what is Total saying. They're probably saying that they're basically like a renewable energy company now. But they're not. They all have plans to increase oil and gas production, and we will talk more about that shortly. I think even in this next slide, if I could, Vanessa. This just came out in April. There was a big study by Global Witness and Oil Change International, finding that 20 big oil and gas companies, all of which signed up to the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement was that international agreement where countries around the world all committed to trying to keep global temperatures to 1.5 degrees warming. All of these 20 oil and gas companies have plans to absolutely shatter that 1.5 degrees target, global heating target, by spending $932 billion on new oil and gas developments by the end of the decade. So at the very moment, we need to not be opening up new oil and gas fields, which the International Energy Agency says. At the very moment, we have to, the IPCC says, cut emissions in half by the end of this decade. We've got these big oil and gas companies saying, no, we're going to extract more and we're going to find new developments. So, oh, my papers are blowing everywhere, sorry. Next slide, please, Vanessa. So there's no indication that they're shifting away from fossil fuels. We just don't have, there's no indication. And in fact, there was a study that focused on some of the bigger oil and gas companies and looked at their performance, looked at what they actually had done over the last decade plus, and they found no indication of them moving away from fossil fuels. Again, contrary to what they were saying in their PR, in their social media, et cetera. Next slide, Vanessa. The other problem with oil and gas companies is the fact that they lobby against climate action. So they are anti-democratic. They're working hard to stop climate legislation from being passed around the world. And in fact, The 5 oil majors, this was in 2019, is reported in The Guardian, spend about $200 million per year collectively trying to control and delay climate policies. And we know, for example, ExxonMobil, which is one of the biggest oil and gas companies in the world, has effectively done that in the United States. They've killed Joe Biden's legislation, and they admitted on camera, they got caught on camera by environmental activists, 1 or 2 of their executives did last year, admitting that they do this, that they work to kill climate legislation. Next slide, please. To put this in perspective, COP26 was the big UN climate change conference we had in Glasgow last year. If fossil fuel companies were their own independent country, they had the biggest delegation at COP26. If we took all of the fossil fuel executives and lobbyists, they outnumbered any other country. Next slide, please. So again, what's the rhetoric? What's the reality? The rhetoric is, these are basically renewable energy companies that, oh yeah, by the way, we get a bit of oil and gas out of the ground from time to time. The reality is, and this is just from just weeks ago, from the IEA's World Energy Investment Report, fossil fuel companies, and I think this would surprise a lot of people and surprise the British public, spend about 5% of their investment on clean energy, okay? So they spend, on average, 95% of their investment money getting more fossil fuels out of the ground, not operating in good faith. Next slide, please. There's also the ecological damage that they do. So this is BP planning to drill for fossil gas on the edge of the world's largest cold water coral reef. Next slide, please. This is our friend, Operation Noah. We work with her, Reverend Dr. Rachel Mash, who's an amazing activist in South Africa. And Rachel is part of something called Green Anglicans. She works with churches and Anglican groups around the world, and especially in Southern Africa. And Rachel says, fossil fuel companies see Africa as the next frontier for exploration. But there's a problem with that. Not just the global heating implications of what will happen if we burn those fossil fuels, but in terms of how people are being treated. Next slide, please. Rachel talks about what she calls the oil curse. I don't know if anyone's heard of that, the oil curse. But in a lot of the global south, people are promised by oil and gas companies prosperity and jobs and a great life. But in fact, a lot of the countries that have the most oil and gas and have been exploited by the oil and gas companies have a lot of turmoil, and people are very poor. So this money's it's not trickled down to local people. Next slide, please. And in fact, in a lot of the global south, people, unlike maybe you or me, they don't have legal documents to show that they are legally occupying a piece of land. So if a Western company comes, it shows up one day and says, you need to leave, and we're putting a pipeline here, and we're probably not going to compensate you unless you can show me that you own this land, and they don't have anything to show they own it, they've just lived there for generations, their families lived there for generations, they're gone, they're evicted, they're homeless, they're kicked off their land. Next slide, please. There's also the political instability. There's a chain reaction of things that happen when communities in the global south begin to be a target for a new oil and gas development. If you then get kicked off your land, if you then lose your job, if your environment then gets badly polluted, what happens? People get radicalized. People get angry. They have nowhere to turn. They join a militia. There's violence. Next slide, please. This is someone I worked with. He's the bishop, the Anglican bishop of Nampula in northern Mozambique. He's called Reverend Ernesto Manuel, Bishop Manuel. He says, get your money. First of all, he says, get your money out of fossil fuels. He says that. But he says they destabilize communities. Fossil fuels destabilize communities. Next slide, please, Vanessa. I talked to him just a couple of weeks ago. He did a webinar for the organization I work for Operation Noah. And he said, I want to try and find his quote. He said, in northern Mozambique, we have the situation of conflict. That started right from the arrival of the fossil fuel companies. The conflict started right at the gas prospection areas. It started as local clashes, but has escalated into open conflict. Over 5,000 people have now been killed and near 1 million displaced. Okay? 1 million people displaced in Mozambique, partly because of extreme weather and events that are being fed by this oil and gas, but partly because the community's been destabilized. There's violence. Next slide, Vanessa. But what about the financial risks? Investors might say, okay, Cameron, you've convinced me fossil fuels aren't great for the environment. You've maybe convinced me they're not great for some local communities, but I'm still going to make money. And I don't know, I live in the real world and I need to make money. Well, there are two words I would say to that person, and that's stranded assets. And that's something financial managers and people in finance have been talking about for a number of years now. And that's an indication that there is a huge amount of oil and gas that's not going to be able to be extracted because of catastrophic global heating. We're going to have to leave the vast majority of oil and gas in the ground. But fossil fuel companies have not written off that investment yet. And one of the reasons they're trying so desperately to stall climate legislation is because they stand to lose an incredible amount of money. And so do investors when that happens, and it will happen. Next slide, Vanessa. Other people say to me, Cameron, that's great. I doubt this works. Who thinks this works? Who thinks divestment works? And I always say to them, Shell does. Because in 2018, Shell in its annual report said, some groups are pressuring investors to divest their investments in fossil fuel companies. If this were to continue, it could have a material adverse effect on the price of our securities and ability to access capital markets. Okay? So even the fossil fuel companies recognize that the divestment movement's a bit dangerous for them. Next slide, please. First empirical study by university researchers finds that divestment actually works. It actually has an impact. And in fact, I'll read you a quote from that. It can exert sufficient selling pressure to cause the stock prices of climate-damaging stocks to fall in the long run. That's what one of the researchers said about their study. Next slide, please. Also, this is what I talked about at the beginning. Why do we do divestment? It makes it more expensive for fossil fuel companies to finance their projects. That was from Bloomberg Green. Cost of capital spikes, the cost of borrowing money spikes for fossil fuel producers. Next slide. Here's another great quote from John Ardell, who's VP of one of the worst companies in the world, ExxonMobil. He says, we won't run out of oil and gas, but we could run out of funding. That's what we need. Next slide, please. Rowan Williams, you may not be a religious person, you may be an atheist, but Rowan Williams, let me say this, from early on supported Extinction Rebellion, and as the former Archbishop of Canterbury, he understands a lot of things, and he understands that divestment works and will send a positive and hopeful message, and he advocates it. Next slide, Vanessa. This was our big divestment announcement by faith institutions I helped coordinate last year before COP26. It was a record, the most ever faith institutions to jointly announce their divestment, 72 groups. Next slide. And then the one I mentioned earlier, 35 faith organizations representing over $1 billion divesting. How can you be involved? This is the last. I'll end here and then we can have any questions you might have. How can you be involved? Divest your faith group, divest your pension fund, Many of us here will have pension funds. You may not know what that pension fund's invested in. I bet it's invested in fossil fuels. Divest UK councils. We've got Councillor Clyde Lokes is going to be here later. I'd like to ask him about this because Waltham Forest has committed to divesting, Waltham Forest Council. I don't think they've completed that process yet. Be interested to know where they are in that process. Get banks out of fossil fuels. This is another big problem. HSBC, most of the big banks you can think of, suddenly I've blanked on the names of banks, most of the big banks you can think of are still financing fossil fuels. We need that to stop. And then kick fossil fuels. This is again part of removing that social license I talked about earlier. Kick fossil fuels out of our museums and cultural institutions. Fossil fuel companies have sponsored exhibits on climate change at the Science Museum here in London. You know, fossil fuel companies have sponsored big exhibits at the British Museum. We shouldn't have to look at their logo any more than we should have to look at an arms company's logo when we go to a museum. So organizations, there are lots I have not listed on this. Friends of the Earth, Fossil Free London, there are all kinds of amazing groups. But Operation Noah, we work on faith-based divestment. UK Divest, they're particularly focused on councils and engaging with elected officials. Culture Unstained, this is an amazing group that are working to kind of kick these fossil fuel companies out of our cultural institutions and museums. Stop Cambo, Stop Jackdaw, this is a group I've worked with at Operation Noah. They are working to stop all new North Sea oil and gas projects. They're amazing people. And then, of course, XR. Some of you here might be involved with XR and raising awareness of the climate crisis across all sectors. So that is what I've got for you. Sorry, that's a huge dump of information, but I would love to hear from you. And if you've got questions or comments or thoughts, I can't promise to be able to say anything intelligent about them, but I bet you can say something intelligent. So just raise your hand or give me a shout out if you want to ask about anything. Vanessa, you could be my first question to get us warmed up. I think Vanessa should be. She's suddenly blanked. She's heard all this before. She has no questions. Oh, sorry. Here we go. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi there. Just a comment as well on the UK government and the fact that we give tax breaks to fossil fuels.
Yes.
Sorry, do you want to use this microphone?
Sorry, we got a roving mic.
Repeat the question. Sorry, if you can
Making
repeat
the
that.
point about tax breaks. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, hi there. It was just a point on the fact that our UK government is still giving tax breaks to fossil fuel companies to do those search projects for new oil fields and what have you. So that's something that is something we should really be highlighting as much as possible to say, well, why are we saving them money but not giving the same amount of funding to renewable energy projects at the same time?
Two things to say about that. A really good point. One thing to say is when Rishi Sunak, who was the Chancellor, who's the Chancellor now? Is it still Nadhim Zahawi? When Rishi Sunak was the Chancellor and he was pressured to pass this windfall tax on oil and gas companies because they were reporting record profits. And I don't know if you picked this up, but Rishi Sunak put a loophole in there that oil and gas companies could avoid much of that tax by investing in new oil and gas in the North Sea, which is the exact thing we don't need. But to your other point, huge amounts of public money have gone into subsidizing fossil fuels. And there's another campaign group I didn't mention, but they're actually a break-off of Stop Cambo, and they're called Paid to Pollute. And they've been seeking legal routes to try and stop the UK government from giving public money to fossil fuel companies. Yeah, really good point. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that really informative presentation. I'm just interested in who thinks it's a good idea to buy these assets, like when they're being sold, when they're being divested, because surely you have to have a willing buyer in order to get rid of it. Yeah. So some people must think they can make money out of it still. Yeah. That's
a good question. One of the critiques sometimes of divestment has been that when you take, that sometimes these assets that are then divested are purchased by groups that are a bit shadowy and harder to pressure or to speak into. And so I think it's a fair point. Yeah, who buys these assets once you sell them on? We believe, and we have good evidence to believe, that the overwhelming thrust of the divestment movement is positive. But you're exactly right. I think there are people and groups who are largely unaccountable, including state-run fossil fuel companies. So Gazprom, Russia, one of the 20 companies that's planning on spending almost $1 trillion on new oil and gas is not a publicly traded company. It's Gazprom, which is the Russian state-owned oil and gas company. So you're right. There is a black hole of groups that don't care about any of this stuff. They're just looking to make a profit. But we're trying to create an environment and then a world, and I guess the other half of the equation is, how do you create a world that just doesn't even run on fossil fuels anymore? We don't need it. It's almost worthless because our cars don't use it, and we don't use it to heat our homes. So yeah, thank you. Yes.
There's one down there as well.
Oh, sorry, was there one down here first? I'm sorry. Sorry. My long-sighted vision is bad, so I apologize.
Hello, so my name is Uzma. I'm one of the councillors in the borough for Grove Green, which is just next door to Leytonstone Ward, so there might be some of my residents here, actually. And it's great to know that Waltham Forest is, committed to that, and we've done a lot with our green strategy recently. I'm really curious to know how many councils have committed to divestment so far, and is there anything we can do as councillors to encourage our kind of neighbouring colleagues or our colleagues across the country who work in council, who work in local government, and what can we do from our side? Because I think it's really important that we get a unified strategy across the country, not just in pockets. So yeah.
Yeah, great question. In terms of how many councils around the country have divested, I don't know that information. I know that if you go to the UK Divest website, they have a search tool that allows you to search for a given council and see, but I don't know off the top of my head how many have divested. How can councillors, pressure other? I mean, I would look to see, what forums are councils a part of where they talk to each other. There must be forums and mechanisms whereby councils share information. I think that could be an environment where groups could be pressured. I think I would like Waltham Forest to shout about it a bit more, actually. Can we speed up our divestment in Waltham Forest? And then can we talk about it a bit more? I think that would be really good. Thank you. Yes, sir, yeah.
I'm looking around the audience, and I'm wondering how many people here remember the miners' strike? Any? Yeah. Oh, right, good. Now, if you talk to miners, I'll ask a question and make a point. Then if you talk to miners, they would have found it very difficult to understand why they should stop cutting coal and it being burnt.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons was they knew what would happen if the coal fields were closed down.
Yeah.
And I spent 10 years as a trustee of the Coalfields Regeneration Trust, which tried to support the communities which were devastated by the destruction of the coalfields. So my question is, how are you going to persuade those people who will suffer from disinvestment that actually it's in their interests to bear that pain?
Yeah. And I think that's where this whole just transition movements come in. And the just transition movement, the one I'm involved in, isn't directly involved in supporting the workers who are most impacted. But I think that's got to be part of a just transition, is to say, where are the communities that are going to be most, Aberdeen, how's Aberdeen going to be impacted by this? And how can we make sure that those communities are supported in a way that the coal mining communities were not supported in this country? You're absolutely right, because that's what makes people nervous, isn't it? Any change, there are losers. And am I going to lose, and how am I going to be impacted and hurt? And I think those are the people we need to be engaging with as well. Absolutely, so important. And actually part of that Paid to Pollute campaign that I talked about that's affiliated with Stop Cambo, where they were suing the UK government about these, it's giving the public money that it has to fossil fuels. One or two of the claimants were former oil and gas workers. And one of their points was, stop subsidizing fossil fuel companies and start subsidizing communities that are gonna have to transition. So, yeah, great point, thank you.
Hi there, thanks so much for the talk, Cameron. I've got a simple question, I guess. I was curious to hear that we have already enough oil and gas, and I'm getting a different message from people who work in the oil and gas sector, lawyers, and they are convinced that that we need more to cover the period until we have enough renewable energy. And these are clever people, and so I'm just thinking, how could I counter that or explain, or what is it based on? Why are they so convinced that that's the case? So that's one question. And I forgot my second question. Oh no, the second question is, if it is already available, why is it suddenly so expensive? I'm a bit simple-minded, I guess, but that's my question.
Yeah, sorry, say that again, that second question.
The second question, why is it so expensive if there is already so much or enough oil and gas?
Sure. To the second point, there's literally a cartel, isn't there, that controls that controls oil. So that may be part of the answer. But to your first question, which was around, oh yes, do we have enough oil and gas already? And if we do, why are people saying we don't? The International Energy Agency, in its reports, and Fatih Birol, who's the head of the International Energy Agency, has said, we have enough oil and gas from existing developments to support a transition. And I suppose the difficult thing is, it's always hard to convince someone of something that they don't want to, that's not in their interest to be convinced by, isn't it? So, and that's really why we advocate for divestment and not for engaging with fossil fuel companies. Because when you engage with a fossil fuel company, unlike some activist investor engagement, say you're invested in a coffee company, Starbucks, and you want Starbucks to switch the cups that it uses to more sustainable cups. You can probably affect that change as an investor. If you get enough investors on board and you hold stock in Starbucks and you get together, you can force that change, probably. But what you're trying to convince as an investor the oil and gas companies to do is to stop doing what they do and to write off most of their assets. That's why it doesn't work, because it's totally against their interest. And I guess I just say that to say that it's difficult to convince people of something where they stand to lose an incredible amount of money. But the science is really clear about what we need to do. It's really clear. And it's not discussed enough. We don't hear that stat enough that we have to cut global greenhouse gas emissions almost in half in less than 10 years. We don't hear that enough. We don't hear enough that we don't need new oil and gas fields. And in fact, we have enough. We have more than enough from existing developments to support the transition to renewable energy. So I think that, and again, the other thing I didn't mention is that fossil fuel companies, and this is why we believe in divestment as well, is because they've funded disinformation for decades, and that's not a conspiracy theory. There was a big documentary in United States public television just in the last few months about big oil and how they lied, how they've funded PR campaigns that got people to believe things that weren't true. If global warming's happening, why was it so cold this year in Wichita? Things like that. They tried to sow seeds of doubt about what was actually happening when they knew their own scientists told them many decades ago what was happening. So I think that's what's difficult, is we're not working with people who have a track record of working in good faith and working with what's actually going on. Yeah. Yes, Dave,
I think there's maybe time for just one quick question. Is that one quick? Right.
Just thanks very much for that. And on that last point, because the fossil fuel companies have been great at controlling the narrative and ensuring that there is doubt, do you know, or have you got an idea on how we can counter that? How can we get that other message out there? How can we give that other narrative that people can truly understand and believe?
Yeah. I think the best way, I mean, this isn't the most exciting answer, but I think the best way is to think, for each of us, to think about what is our own personal sphere of influence. Okay? So for me, you think, oh, Cameron, okay, I quite like the talk, but I don't know, he banged on a lot about church and stuff like that, and I'm not into church. Well, that's my sphere of influence. I grew up in church, it's my culture. And I can influence my culture. Though, love them or hate them, and sometimes I hate them, I hate to say that, but I try hard to love them. Those are my people. Who are your people? Who can you influence? What groups are you a part of? Who trusts you? I think, and how can you then build power to bring other people with you? I think that's the question for each of us. And then how can we build power together, through some of these bigger movements? So that's a great question. Thank you. Thanks so much for your attention. It was really, really good to talk to you today. Thanks, David.
Yeah. Cameron, thank you so much. Yeah, big round of applause. Cameron.